I thought I had it all, a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a life many would envy. But one text message changed everything. My mornings used to start with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and my husband's warm smile. Michael, my husband, was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. He was attentive, kind, and always made sure I felt loved. Our home felt like a sanctuary, filled with laughter, shared dreams, and a promise of forever. Yet, deep down, there was a restlessness I couldn't explain. One evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, a message popped up. "Hey, it's been a while. How have you been?" It was from Ryan, my college boyfriend. Seeing his name felt like a jolt to my heart. Memories of late-night talks, stolen kisses, and dreams we once shared flooded back. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, but then curiosity got the better of me. I replied. The messages started innocently enough. We caught up on each other's lives, exchanged updates about mutual friends, and shared snippets of the years we had missed. But soon our conversations grew deeper. Ryan's words had a way of making me feel seen, heard and understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. Michael began to notice changes in me. "You seem distracted lately," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. I brushed off his concerns, blaming work stress and fatigue. But the truth was, my mind was elsewhere, with Ryan. Late at night, when Michael was asleep, I would sneak into the living room to talk to Ryan. Those conversations felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the monotony I hadn't even realized I was drowning in. Yet every time I heard Michael's soft breathing from the bedroom, a pang of guilt would creep in. I told myself it was harmless. After all, it was just words on a screen, right? But words have power. They can build bridges, reignite old flames, and create worlds where the heart can roam freely. And with every word I exchanged with Ryan, I felt the walls of my marriage tremble. One weekend, Michael planned a surprise dinner. He cooked my favourite meal, lit candles, and played the song from our wedding. "I just wanted to remind you how much I love you," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. My heart ached as I smiled back, unable to meet his gaze for too long. How could I explain that while he was here, pouring his heart out to me, my mind was miles away, with someone else? The tension in our home grew palpable. Michael's gestures of love began to feel like a spotlight on my own deceit. And yet, I couldn't stop. The thrill of reconnecting with Ryan was intoxicating, blinding me to the cracks forming in my once perfect life. One text message. That's all it took to set my world spinning, and as I stood at the edge of a precipice, I had no idea how far I would fall. The text exchanges with Ryan quickly became the highlight of my days. I found myself smiling at my phone more often, my heart racing with every notification. What started as a harmless reconnection began to morph into something deeper, something dangerous. Ryan's words carried a charm that was impossible to resist. "I've never stopped thinking about you," he admitted one evening. His confession sent shivers down my spine. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard, but I found myself typing back, "Neither have I." From that moment, our conversations shifted. The nostalgia gave way to confessions, and those confessions turned into desires. We began to relive the passion we once shared, creating a fantasy that felt more real than my current life. I started making excuses to leave the house, a last-minute work meeting, a trip to the store, just so I could talk to him freely. Michael, ever the observant husband, noticed these changes. "You're always on your phone lately," he said one night as we lay in bed. I could hear the hurt in his voice, but I brushed him off with a forced laugh. "Just work stuff," I replied, avoiding his eyes. The lies began to pile up, each one weighing heavier than the last. But with Ryan, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced in years. He reminded me of who I used to be, young, carefree, and full of dreams. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in my marriage. Then came the first meeting. We agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far enough to avoid prying eyes. My hands trembled as I stepped inside, scanning the room until I saw him. Ryan looked just as I remembered, though a bit older, with lines on his face that only added to his charm. "You came," he said, his smile lighting up the room. I nodded, unable to speak as a wave of emotions crashed over me. We talked for hours, laughing and reminiscing as if no time had passed. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. But as I drove home that night, the weight of what I was doing began to sink in. Michael was waiting for me, his love unwavering despite the distance I had put between us. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to let go of Ryan. The thrill, the passion, the connection. It was all too intoxicating to give up. Michael tried harder to bridge the growing gap between us. He planned date nights, left me sweet notes, and held me close at night. But his efforts only served as a stark reminder of my betrayal. The guilt gnawed at me, but the pull of Ryan was stronger. The affair was no longer just a fantasy. It had become my reality, and with each passing day, I felt myself slipping further away from the life I once knew. And yet, I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. The moment Michael found out was both inevitable and devastating. He stumbled upon a text notification from Ryan on my phone while I was in the shower. The words were simple but damning. "I can't wait to see you again." When I walked into the bedroom, his face was pale, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Who is Ryan?" he asked, his voice trembling. My heart stopped. I stood frozen, unable to form a coherent response. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. "He's just a friend," I lied, but the words felt hollow even to me. Michael's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "Don't insult me with lies," he snapped. "How long has this been going on?" The confrontation that followed was raw and brutal. Michael demanded answers, and I, cornered and guilt-ridden, confessed everything. The pain in his eyes was unbearable. He yelled, he cried, and then he fell into a silence that was even more painful than his words. "I gave you everything," he whispered, more to himself than to me. Ryan, on the other hand, was oblivious to the storm brewing in my home. When I told him what had happened, his response was far from comforting. "I never asked you to ruin your marriage," he said, his tone defensive. The fantasy we had built began to crumble as reality set in. Michael packed a bag that night. He couldn't look at me as he said, "I need time. Don't call me." As I watched him walk out the door, the weight of my choices came crashing down. The house felt emptier than ever, and for the first time I realized what I had truly lost. In the weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of my shattered life. Ryan and I continued to see each other, but the excitement that once defined our relationship was gone. Every moment with him was tainted by guilt and regret. The spark that had drawn us together dimmed under the harsh light of reality. Michael's absence was a constant ache. I found myself replaying our happiest moments, wondering how I had let things spiral so far out of control. I reached out to him several times, but my calls went unanswered. The silence was deafening. Ryan, too, began to pull away. The weight of our actions was too much for either of us to bear. One evening, as we sat in the very cafe where it all began, he looked at me and said, "I think we made a mistake." His words, though painful, echoed my own thoughts. We parted ways that night, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered dreams. Michael eventually agreed to meet me. We sat across from each other in a sterile coffee shop, the distance between us palpable. "I loved you," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "but I don't think I can ever trust you again." His words were a dagger to my heart, but I knew he was right. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. As I walked away from that meeting, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had lost everything, my husband, my home, and the life we had built together. But in that loss, I found a hard truth. The grass isn't always greener on the other side. Sometimes the life you have is more beautiful than you realize. Now, I spend my days trying to rebuild. I've started therapy, focusing on understanding myself and the choices I made. It's a long road, but I'm determined to walk it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: love is precious, and once lost, it leaves a void that nothing else can fill. In chasing one love, I lost another I never thought I'd live without, and that's a mistake I'll carry with me forever.